Hello, my name is Nathan Utter, and I'm making an argument for the use of nationalistic government as opposed to imperialism. Systems of government exist to lead, unify, and direct nations. These systems can fall into two categories, either imperialism or nationalism. Nationalism focuses on the rule of its own people, while imperialism is more concerned with the rule of others. Whether a nation seeks to rule distant lands or is content with the serving of its own people, individual citizens retain certain rights to participate in the success of their country. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, Star Wars. This fantastical galaxy, created in the imagination of famed director George Lucas, has been a worldwide cultural staple for more than half a century, as it follows the constant battle between the forces of light and darkness. More specifically, Lucas's story highlights a brave rebel alliance, fighting to free themselves from the tyranny of the Empire. Ultimately, this small yet unified group of rebels succeeds in pushing the Empire away and freeing themselves from its reign. The events of this story are loosely based on the events that took place in the Algerian War for Independence. In Algeria, on All Saints' Day, 1954, Algerian forces attacked French forces in hopes to free themselves from French tyranny and control. After nearly 8 years of guerrilla fighting, war, bloodshed, and massacres on both French and Algerian sides, France signed the Even Accords, instating a ceasefire and withdrawal of military forces from Algeria. Just as the rebels in Star Wars fought back to free themselves from their oppressors, small, unified, and oppressed nations will rise up to free themselves from the rule of a tyrannical government. I'd like to define a few terms before I continue. Firstly, imperialism. This is known as a large, dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant land or people. Secondly, patriotism. This is the feeling of love, devotion, and attachment to a particular people group, nation, or state. Secondly, culture. These are the arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people group, or social group. And thirdly and finally, nationalism. The nationalism is a viewpoint that the world is ruled best when individual citizens have the right to discern their own independent course of action, free from the outside jurisdiction of others. This view is often viewed as superior to imperialism. Yoram Hazany, the author of A Virtue for Nationalism, argues that nationalism is a superior option because it helps foster national unity, encourage cultural diversity, and limit international conflict. On June 28, 1914, Gavio Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Princip's ties to Serbia led Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia 1 month later. Austria sought support from its ally, Germany, who responded with a blank check, offering unconditional assistance for the war. Germany, being a relatively new nation, sought to instill its status as a major world power through this war. The German government was already pursuing imperial expansion throughout Africa and sought to extend its influence into Europe and beyond. In response to Germany's aggressive expansion, Britain and France intervened in this conflict in hopes to free themselves from Germany's tyranny. Ultimately, Germany's imperial ambitions were leading factors which led to the rise and start of World War I. A nation-focused approach by Germany could have prevented the entire war. In its pursuit of recognition and the establishment of an empire, Germany became involved in a conflict that did not directly concern it. A nation-focused stance regarding the war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia would have been for Germany to step back and allow the fighting to take place without intervention. By taking this step back, a nation can focus on their own well-being as opposed to outside international interests. One example of a war taking a step back in order to decrease the amount of lives lost and save the country is the story of America during the initial part of World War II. This war primarily took place on European soil, allowing America to remain neutral. During this time, America was facing great difficulties on the outset of the Great Depression, and therefore, recognizing that they were unfit for an international conflict, chose to remain neutral. But by remaining neutral, this allowed America to recover economically while saving many men that would have been lost in war. A second example of a war that was prevented by nationalism is the story of Italy during the initial part of World War I. When Germany extended the blank check to Austria, Italy was called upon to support its allies, Austria and Germany. However, facing economic difficulties and uncertainties concerning the war, Italy chose to remain neutral. By remaining neutral, Italy saved many thousands of men that could have died in this battle and focused on their own national interests. As a nation concentrates on their own interest as opposed to the international affairs of others, they are able to decrease the amount of lives lost in battle. The establishment of a nationalistic state not only prevents the want to join international conflicts, but also enhances political engagement, which in turn creates voters focusing on the success of their country. To illustrate this concept, I like to consider two groups of people. Group A, which is exceedingly patriotic and loves their country, and Group B, which is indifferent towards it. Individuals in Group A may live their lives similarly to those in Group B, but they take pride in their country. This pride and love for their country affects them when voting. Voters in Group A will vote with the country's best interest in mind, though their views are still subjective. Studi Kamani notes that healthy political engagement, when voters select and sanction leaders based on their performance in delivering public goods, this can improve development outcome by decreasing incentives and creating the amount of better quality leaders. However, Kamani describes Group B as engaging in what he describes as unhealthy political engagement, easily swayed by incentives. An example of an incentive would be voting for president solely based on the promise of free health care or college tuition. As patriotism increases, political engagement also rises, fostering the emergence of capable leaders able of stabilizing the economy. Nationalism and patriotism are key factors in the unification of diverse people groups within a specific country. There is no single culture living within a specific country. Even Japan, which is one of the most culturally homogeneous countries in the world, faces some degree of cultural diversity. Yet nationalistic principles can unite and bring these people together. To further see how this works, I'd like you to consider Indonesia. Indonesia is an island group made up of 6,000 individual islands, 270 million people, over 700 languages, and right at half a dozen religions. The creation of this island was accomplished through hundreds of years of colonization and has systematically led to the wide spectrum of culture. However, these people remain unified. Why is that? In 1945, just days before the founding of this country, a political leader named Sukarno laid out his founding principles for Indonesian identity, calling them Pancasila. These 5 principles were established in order to provide Indonesians a common identity and a way to unite. And this did that. This trend is also exemplified in the founding of America. America, when founding, was also exceedingly diverse and faced large amounts of cultural diversity. However, these people, though so diverse, remain unified through a common goal and want for freedom. Therefore, it is seen that culture does not play a role in the unification of countries. Instead, it is a common nationalistic principles. Although cultural cohesion is not necessary for the unification of diverse people groups within a specific country, nationalistic principles plays a huge role in the preservation of cultures within a nation. First, I'd like to reassess the definition of imperialism. Imperialism is known as a large, dominating metropolitan center ruling a distant land or people. To break that down a little bit, imperialism is a central government ruling a distant and disconnected land. This brings us to a major issue: the preservation of the culture within this said distant and disconnected land. As an imperialistic power rules this land, the annexation process slowly degenerates and destroys the culture within this land. One modern example of this is the story of Hawaii and its annexation into America. Emma Kawana Asoro, a writer who studies the decline in Hawaiian culture, states that in observance to Western thought and rule, Hawaii faced a significant decline in culture. Had Hawaii remained a separate and sovereign nation, free from the jurisdiction of America, this culture would not have been lost. When nations remain sovereign and are not ruled by this large, dominating, metropolitan center, they are able to preserve cultural traditions that could be lost. A powerful example of when culture was key to America is the story of the Navajo Indians and the Navajo Code Talkers. During World War II, the Navajo Indians helped create a code that was unbreakable by the Japanese. Since the Navajos had no form of written language, which made this code unbreakable. This allowed Americans to communicate battle plans, troop movement, and security information without the threat of the Japanese overhearing. Their contributions led to key battle wins such as Iwo Jima and others. Had Americans fully incorporated these Navajo Indians into our land, then we would have lost this culture and therefore lost many wars during World War II. I would like to define one more term before I begin my counter-arguments. That term is bilateral wars. A bilateral war is a war between two distinct nations that happens without the outside interference of others. Nationalism can act as an usher for bringing nations into bilateral wars. For one example of a nation brought into a bilateral war because of nationalism is the story of Japan and the Second Sino-Japanese War. Although Japan's involvement in the Second Sino-Japanese War eventually led to its involvement in World War II, initially it was purely based on nationalistic principles. Japan, being an island, lacked key resources for expansion, such as natural gas, oil, and coal, making economic expansion close to impossible. This left Japan with two options: to conquer, or to trade. Being an island group and without viable resources for trading, Japan was left with one option: to conquer. This led Japan into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan was doing this purely based on nationalistic goals. They wanted to expand the economy and therefore make better livelihoods for the people within their culture. They were not attacking based on greed or want for more. Therefore, yes, in some cases, nationalism plays a part in bilateral wars. Nationalism also prevents wars, though, as seen in World War II. It can go both ways. Another point made by pro-imperialist people is that imperialism helps spread the joy of Western success onto the uncivilized. One major example of that is the story of Britain and its control of Africa. In the 1800s, many countries were fighting fiercely for control over this continent. These imperialists justified the spreading and invading of Africa as spreading the joy of Western success onto the brutes. They claimed right to their land by strength and conquest. Many people living were categorized as unfit to live, and the only thing left to do was to take note of their lives and culture and remove them from their miserable existence. During this time, the British also pushed that they were allowing Africans into their land in order to give them rights and liberties that they did not earlier possess. This was false, for Britain had ulterior motives. They did not want to give them rights. They wanted the raw resources offered by their land. In theory, these Africans would annex willingly. In practice, they did not. And the taking of Africa was accomplished through force and conquest. This view is opposed to nationalism, which advocates us to respect fellow nations as real people, no matter how small they be. Nationalism stands for focusing on countries' own citizens and strengthening its economy, not the destruction of small, independent nations. Nationalism, when properly practiced, offers the ability to limit international conflict, encourage cultural diversity, and inspire national unity. As discussed previously, USA remained neutral in the early part of World War II, saving thousands of Americans' lives in a country on the verge of economic collapse. Therefore, as seen, nationalism not only prevents wars, but it also reigns supreme in cultural diversity found within Indonesian government. The coexistence of distinct cultures within this unified nation shows the pursuit of national unity and cultural diversity achieved in this state. Throughout life, we understand the important role that culture plays in our world and must seek to preserve it. As Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, famously stated, an attack on cultural heritage is an attack on all humanity. Thank you. I'd now like to open the floor for questions from the judges.
I have a question that will help me better understand your categories of imperialism and nationalism. You said that when Germany jumped into the war and joined the Austrians against Serbia, that they were acting imperially, right? Imperialistically?
You could say that, yes.
If that's not a word, I just made it one. I'm the head of the upper school. I can do it. No, but then later on, when Britain and France jump in, they're acting nationalistically. But they both groups joined into this bigger war. So tell me, what's the difference between the two that makes Germany imperialistic and Britain and France nationalistic?
Okay, so imperialism, my definition, is the spreading of power onto another distant land. And so Germany is doing this by giving the military and therefore extending its influence into Serbia. Whereas Britain is protecting itself and trying to suppress this imperialistic power. And they're fighting for their own causes, trying to limit the power that's given to Germany. Does that make sense?
So if the intent is the expansion of power, that's imperialism?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yes, sir.
Nate, do you want to explain how you got to this topic? Because do you remember how it began?
Yes.
It began with food, which is so funny coming
Yes.
from you. Tell us, how did that, it was culture and cuisine, and then all of a sudden you're like, no, I think I want to do this instead. But it got you there. Tell us that process.
So I was taking the ACT, and I read a passage where it was talked about the decline in Cajun cuisine based on tourism. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to write my thesis on that. And I was like, that's too narrow. And so I expanded it, and I expanded a little more. And then eventually Dad gave me the book, Virtue of Nationalism by Yoram Hazany, which was my key source. And that book was like, wow, this is really cool. And so I dove into that. But I do like the cultural aspect of nationalism a lot more. And that is what really caused me to pick this topic.
So I have several questions, but I'm curious, for instance, the war in Iran and our involvement, would you consider that a nationalistic pursuit or an imperialistic pursuit?
I really haven't researched the war in Iran and Babwa to an extent that I can really give a full opinion based on my thesis. But that's a really good point, and I would love to get back to you about that.
I guess another question that's pretty relevant is what you describe as nationalism, in my mind, was protectionism kind of thing. But I'm curious if you would, do you know what kinism is?
No, I do not.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm not going to try to explain it because it's a little complex, but I'm curious, cultural uniformity seems like it may be tied into your definition of what you would want for nationalism. I'm curious if you could speak to that. Does that question make sense to you?
So you want me to speak to cultural uniformity within nationalism and how that plays a part?
Does it play a part in your desire for nationalism?
I feel like it does in a sense. So nationalism is the preservation of people, right? And I said it was without the jurisdiction of others. So a nation ruling themselves and free from that. And I feel like if it's a generally one culture nation, then that cultural uniformity does play a key role in the preservation. and in the nationalistic principles. So like for say Japan, which is for in a most part a one culture nation, but in another sense there's Indonesia, which is just a huge spectrum of cultures.
Yeah, I appreciate
and
that.
so it goes both ways.
Okay, gotcha. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir. Yes, sir.
First off, great job.
Thank you.
What would you say to those who would say you're buying into this nationalism? Well, that makes us not want to help others. For example, people coming to the country, or people, not want to help other countries who are not doing good financially.
Okay, so I feel like as Christians, we need to help other people in other countries, and that does play a role in like, I'm doing okay, my nation is awesome, I love my nation, and we're successful, and I have the resources to travel and to go do missions, and I feel like that should influence you and be like, yes, we do need to go and help other people. Like, we shouldn't be just isolated to ourselves, like, I'm a nationalistic person, I love myself, not myself, I love my nation, and that's it. But I definitely see where you're going, and I think that is true.
I guess I would ask a question kind of similar to what Mr. Davis asked. He asked if this specific situation is an example of either imperialism or nationalism, but I guess a broader way to ask that would be, are there modern day equivalents for imperialism, let's say? So like, what are some modern examples that we see of imperialism, or are there any?
I feel like there are modern examples of imperialism, especially with what I said it with Hawaii, of course. But further, to go off that a little bit, the American influence on outside lands and peoples, that plays a big role in, like, we have a degeneration of culture within a lot of tribes and a lot of people overseas, because they see us as Americans as like the ideology of what we need to accomplish, like the American dream. And then going off that again a little bit farther, NATO and the UN is like a meeting point, but NATO puts teeth on that meeting point. And I feel like that does play a role in imperialism. And it is a modern example, and it does enforce, like, it's not necessarily a dominating center, but it does enforce center of power onto a distant and disconnected people.
You're saying, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying the NATO organization is an example of imperialism?
Slightly, not to a huge extent,
Right.
as seen.
Say just a little bit more about that.
Okay, I can go a little farther. When I think of imperialism in an older sense, I think of like the Romans oppressing their entire culture. Like, you have to be Roman or you're not one of us. And I feel like there's a much more diluted version of that within NATO, where we make some laws and these third world countries or these uncivilized people, they have to conform to those laws. And that does degenerate the culture within those people. Even though we can see the culture and be like, why do you do that? But it does degenerate the culture, and that is an example of like milder imperialism that is seen today.
Okay.
Would any of the students like to ask a question? Max?
So you made it pretty clear that you agree with nationalism a lot more than imperialism. I was curious if there was any way there could be too much nationalism, or if it could go too far in that direction.
Oh, for sure. There can definitely be too much nationalism. A really good example of that is Hitler and Nazism. So Hitler was like, we are the Aryan race, we're the people, we need to. But his views of his nation and his patriotism morphed into imperialism when he started invading others and trying to build an empire. And also it was just corrupt in that nationalism is a common nationalistic goal. So like for America with freedom, that is one. Or like Indonesia, the Pancasila, that's one. But it can't be a common cultural goal. Does that make sense? So like with the German people, they destroyed the Jewish people because they wanted cultural homogenization, where that is taking nationalism to a far extent that should not be taken to. You see what I'm saying? Sarah.
So take for America, for example, like when it comes to nationalism, like you talk about a lot about culture and identity. America is a nation of a lot of different people, and like we have a lot of immigrants, and while that is a good thing, do you think also there's a sense where we're losing our identity as Americans, and I guess that nationalistic idea of like, is that affecting like our culture? Like, do you think that imperialism can happen on a smaller scale, whereas that's affecting the control of like the identity of a larger country, I guess?
I definitely do see an erosion of culture just in general because of the world economy, not the world, the worldwide web network where I can text somebody in Japan right now. But definitely we are losing some of our national goal. But I feel like at the same time, America was built on freedom, and we have freedom. And people come from all over the world to live here. I'm not talking about legal immigration. People who immigrate legally come and they want that freedom. And so in that sense, we still have a lot of the same nationalistic goals. We all still want the same nationalistic unity, and we are still unified through that want for freedom. Andrew.
So I too like Cajun food. I was deeply interested by that article about Cajun food and tourism. So could you talk something about that?
I would love to. So
Entirely unrelated to your thesis, but go ahead.
So Cajun cuisine is actually the gumbo specifically is supposed to be, apparently it's supposed to be dark and thick, which is exactly opposed to what it was originally supposed to be. It was originally supposed to be a light and creamy soup. And so with, what's it called? With tourism, they had this cook that moved to New Orleans. And he basically trademarked the dark and creamy soup. And he started teaching it to chefs in New Orleans. And from that point, and from the want to make like a business out of that, he morphed the view of Cajun cuisine as from light and like airy into this dark and I'm getting mixed up in my words, but like you know what I mean.
Well, on that note, now that we know we're all eating imperialized gumbo, we are going to wrap it up. You did a great job, Marie.